Forest, wildlife, and the making of modern India's ecological imagination. Professor Mahesh Rangarajan, welcome. Floor is
Thank you.
yours.
Thank you, Imran. That's a very kind introduction. I'm unsure if I, I, I can live up to all the wonderful things you said. It's a tad embarrassing, but I think it's a great privilege and honor to be with you on this historic day. Tomorrow is the anniversary of Indian independence. India achieved dominion status in 1947, and 3 years later, the Republic was proclaimed. It's very interesting that the past lives on in many ways. We have to understand the past better, to know why we are at the present juncture, how we came to the present juncture, and what were the processes by which choices were made. This is important, not because we can emancipate ourselves from the past, not because we should try and discover some golden era in the past. You know, there's a big debate on when the golden era was, but rather than look at Soneri Kal in the past, it is important to prepare for the future. And one of the very important things about history as a discipline is it cannot predict the future. So if a historian tells you the answer to any question, however simple, it will be long and it will be complicated. The reason it will be long is because there are no simple answers. When we look at what happened, we also look at why, we also look at how. And predicting the future is always a tricky business because the future is always full of surprises. But let me begin at the point at which Imran began. A few years before independence, Lord Wavell, the second last viceroy, was on a tiger shoot with Jim Corbett. They were sitting in a machan, and the beaters were still far away. The tiger was also far away. And there was time to have some chit-chat. Now, Wavell's son, Lord Glendowen, wrote a book called Viceroy's Journal, from which I recount this conversation. This conversation will really fascinate you, as it fascinated me. What will happen, Wavell asked Corbett, to the tiger when we're gone? Corbett said, it won't last even 10 years, because every Indian will have the vote, every peasant will have the axe, and every peasant will have the plow. The forests will be cut, the tigers will be killed, so will the deer. And with the British Raj vanishing, so will the tiger. This was very much a sort of a white man's view of the world. I say white and man advisedly, because we should recall that as in the year 1918, the end of the Great War, 25% of the Earth's landmass, that is the surface area of the Earth, was under British rule in one form or the other. The jewel in the crown, of course, was India, and British presence in India goes back a long way. But the first time they got revenue rights was in Bengal after the Battle of Palashi in 1757. They got the land rights in 1764. And very soon after, 3 years after, they started giving out bounties for tigers. So, this British relationship with Indian wild animals is quite old. And in a sense, it lives on. As you know, in 1972, there was an announcement that Indian government would have a project called Project Tiger. It benefited a lot from $1 million given by what was then called the World Wildlife Fund. And the press conference to announce Project Tiger, Dr. Karan Singh spoke at it. He was the chair of the Indian Board for Wildlife. He was the former Maharaja of Jammu and Kashmir. And next to him was Guy Mountfort, a very important trustee of the World Wildlife Fund. And Dr. Karan Singh couldn't resist a dig. He said, when the Raj was powerful, Englishmen killed hundreds of tigers. They boasted of their large records. That's what he was referring to. But now an Englishman has come to help India to save its tigers. So the Raj lives on in other ways. The very large developed countries in terms of economies played a role in expanding the conservation footprint in countries such as India. Project Tiger, of course, 80% of the funding came from union and state government, and it was at its time the world's largest wildlife conservation program. I think it's important to understand that there was a change in the representation and imagery of wildlife after independence. It didn't happen immediately. I'm always struck that the first two heads of state, Wavell was followed by Mountbatten, then he's followed by Rajaji, and the first president of India, as you all know, was Rajendra Prasad. And Rajaji was asked by the Inspector General of Forests, why don't we give some swaraj to the wild animals also? So he asked, what do you mean? And he said, you have a Governor General shooting block in the Shivalings. Why don't we stop hunting over there? This then became the Motichur and Rajaji Wildlife Sanctuaries and is now the Rajaji Wildlife Park. Till then, it was reserved for hunting and shoots by the Viceroy. So across India, there were different areas which are reserved for different military leaders. And remember, many of the viceroys were military men, Wavell and Mountbatten included. And it was an aspect of imperial power to show their strength and their courage vis-a-vis the animals of the forest. It's a different matter. These were often shot in large beats. They were shot from a machan or from elephant back or on howdah. But I think it's significant that the princes and the military civilian authorities indulged in a lot of hunting and shikar because it was an aspect of their power, feudal power, imperial power, princely power, military power. The hunt was not simply a means to kill the animal, display a trophy, procure meat for the table. It was also a manifestation of power over people. It's not a coincidence in the Constituent Assembly. India adopts its constitution, as you know, 29th November 1949. It is signed, the document, and the Republic is proclaimed on 26 January 15. But one of the interesting debates in the Constituent Assembly is about something called begar, forced labor. You see, when these shikar parties went into forest areas or mountain areas, they needed a lot of people to cook, to do their beating, to collect firewood, to set up tents. And though they took a large number of retainers with them, they were never quite enough. And these beaters were not paid. This was a form of begar. Begar was also used, by the way, by the forest department and by large landed elements. In fact, begar is a very important issue raised in the early peasant movements. And the Constitution specifically says all forms of forced labor are forbidden, including begar. So begar had a very close connection with hunts. One of the members, in fact, raised in the Constituent Assembly the fact that in his constituency, people had to stand for hours in the swamps and the mudflats and in the jails till it was time for the prince and his guests to take their place in the blinds. And they would then do a haka for the ducks and geese, which would then fly over the blind and be shot. And this practice continued in Bharatpur in 1969, when the privy purses were abolished. So the end of empire in 47 did not mean the end of the practices of empire. As you know, in the early years after independence, 47 to roughly 69, the priority was economic growth. Large forest areas were cleared in places like the Tarai for settling refugees. The coming of DDT helped to control malaria. The expansion of agriculture was given priority. Forest areas, as per the forest policy of 1952, the priority was to generate raw material for industry. And all of this meant a huge assault on the uncultivated lands. Not only the birds and animals, but the entire habitats were often obliterated or degraded in significant ways. I think there's a change in the late 1960s, and part of it, of course, is to do with the fact there were successive years of drought. There was a new Prime Minister, Mrs. Indira Gandhi, and she was very alert and alive to these sensibilities. And there's a new kind of ecological patriotism where nature and natural heritage is seen as important to India. It's no coincidence that the year 1972, when the Indian Board for Wildlife set up the task force on the tiger, it also was a year when the government of India proclaimed that the tiger would be the national animal in place of the lion, which remained the state animal of Gujarat. Now, these are animals, and I'll come to this in a moment, which had long associations with royalty and state making, as did the elephant. But it's significant that when the tiger becomes the national animal, the Prime Minister in her statement, 26 March 1973, said that Project Tiger abounds in irony. The country that has been renowned for centuries for this magnificent beast is battling now to save it from extinction. Then she went on to say that the tiger cannot be preserved in isolation, and it has to be preserved with the larger ecosystem of which it is a part. She didn't use the word ecosystem. She used the word that it's the apex of the ecological pyramid, which itself is interesting. She then went on to say that the project would only succeed if it had support not only from central and state governments, but from the people. And here is a dilemma, which I think would continue in the years from 69 to 89, which saw preservation zones and protected areas vastly expand from 1 to 5% of the landscape. But I think that in the succeeding period, post 91, the era we are living through of economic reform, of very large scale changes in the regulatory management system, which Imran alluded to, because there is a priority given to economic growth, but also because of increasing assertions of rights, many of which are recognized, the Forest Rights Act of 2006, for instance. There is a very different picture that is emerging today. But in all of this, the long career, or not long in historical terms, from 47 to now, we see the imprint and the legacy of the very long colonial imperial period. I began by pointing out that very soon after the Battle of Palashi, bounties began to be given for tigers and wolves in Bengal. So why were these bounties being given and what were they? Well, they were rewards. If you killed a tiger or a wolf, you went to the local official, you provided proof that you had killed the animal, and you collected a reward. It is very important to note that these rewards were general. You got it for any tiger or any wolf which was killed. So these were seen as animals which were challenging the dominion of man over nature, but more importantly, the dominion of the company polity or the company Bahadur over Indians. They were seen as a threat to the expansion of cultivation and to livestock. Earlier, Indian rulers did come into conflict with animals. We have several accounts of rulers, Jahangir killing a lion near Mandu, Ibrahim Adil Shah hunting tigers, Rani Durgavati hunting tigers in Bastar. This is very commonplace. Often these animals, the large carnivores, had killed domestic livestock. And it was to protect the domestic livestock partly that the ruler went in and showed that he was the protector, in a sense, of the Raya. These animals were, of course, killed also as marks of valor. I think there's a difference because in Europe, there was a tradition going back to the early modern period, even earlier perhaps, where large bounties were given for animals like the wolf or the bear or the fox. And this practice is brought by the English, later the British, into India. This would get systematized in the late 19th century, between 1870s and 1920s. Roughly 1,600 tigers a year were being killed, over 2,000 leopards and wolves each were being killed every year. Now, by then, this process of bounties and rewards for what are called dangerous beasts and venomous snakes gets much more systematized. There are larger bounties for male animals, for female animals than male, and for female cubs than male. So the bounty, for instance, in Uttar Pradesh, United Provinces as it was then called, was higher for a she-wolf than a wolf, and higher for a female wolf cub than a male wolf. It's very important to emphasize this bounty killing was largely done by Indians. There were Indians of different classes, castes, communities, tribes who were killing these animals and collecting the reward. Because we need to acknowledge this, there was a fair degree of conflict between some of these animals and people. In the year 1900, for instance, roughly 15 to 1,600 tigers were killed and 15 to 1,600 humans lost their lives to tigers. This, of course, varies enormously because it's a vast country, and I am referring only to the figures from British India and some of the princely states. So India gets divided up in 1858 when the Crown takes charge. 55% of the British Indian Empire, 4 million square kilometers. It included all of present-day Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Burma. So it's very large. And it has principalities close by which are kept under the thumb, such as Bhutan and Nepal. And there's a lot of ding-dong over who will actually have control in the great game of Afghanistan and Tibet. But to stay with this 4 million square kilometers, little over half was British India. And 45% was the princely states. Some of the princely states were the size of large or medium-sized European countries. In this list would come, of course, Hyderabad, where many of you are. Imran is in Telangana. So would Mysore, Kashmir, Gwalior, and interestingly, there were many small states. In the Western Indian state today of Gujarat, there's an area called Saurashtra. Saurashtra means 100 principalities. It had over 200 principalities, some of which were very small. So you wonder, why did the British divide India up into so many princely states? Well, the answer is very simple. These princely states acceded to the crown. That is, they accepted the authority of the king emperor. What did they promise in return? They promised, it's very important, that they would never wage war against each other. So, if in Saurashtra there was a border between Baroda and Junagadh, they could go to court over the border, but they could not go to war. Also, the princely states provided troops whenever required for services of the British Empire. So very important battles overseas, they deputed and sent forces. Where then did these rulers turn their martial energies? One answer is very simple. They turned them against the birds and animals of the forest. Because in the late 19th century, we have very detailed records of the bags of these rulers. Some of the figures are quite astounding by any stretch. So Maharaja Riva killed 700 tigers. Maharaja Sarguja goes on into independence, kills the record number of tigers ever shot by one individual that we know of, 1,550 plus. He also shot 2,000 leopards. His secretary wrote a letter to the Bombay Naturalistry Society boasting of how His Majesty in one night managed to kill a dozen leopards. It seems what he did was in different places, goats and mongrels, dogs were tied up. And he had a jeep. And he had, this is very important, in age of WhatsApp, he had at that time a great novelty, a telephone. And they would tell him that, Your Majesty, you can come to so-and-so Machan, the leopard has arrived. And he'd arrive, he'd walk the last part on foot, go up the Machan and shoot the leopard. And Sarguja, of course, is also interesting because it's the Sarguja family which shoots 3 cheetahs in 1948. The last record of cheetahs which are shot is in 1948, though the cheetah records go on, as we now know from the work of Divya Bhanu Singh, right up to the mid-1970s. So there were possibly cheetahs around to the mid-70s. The last record of specimens which are taken, that is, they are shot and killed and collected as trophies, of course, is in 1948. So this bounty hunting is something very widespread, but so is shooting for sport. It's very important to unpack this term sport. What is the meaning of sport? And sport is an idea very important to the English landed classes. England was an unusual European country because it never saw a vast revolution of the sort that took place in France and later in Russia. They were in different centuries. In England, except in the 1640s, the landed gentry managed to retain a lot of its assets and privileges despite huge changes. So there was the rise of a very important merchant elite, and the landed elite managed to protect its privileges. One of the very important privileges of the landed elite historically was hunting. I'm sure all of you have heard of a very interesting fictional character in English history called Robin Hood. And I like asking my questions. Where did Robin Hood live? And what did he do? And students, of course, are able to say he lived in the forest of Sherwood. If you go to the forest of Sherwood now, you'll be very disappointed. It was all cut down for charcoal in the 18th century. There's no forest over there now. But when it was a forest, it had deer. And Robin Hood and his many men killed the deer because the deer in England were reserved for the king. And there was a very heavy penalty for poaching of the deer. So by killing the deer, Robin Hood and the outlaws were making a statement. The statement was that the deer were common property of all, not the exclusive property of the king. Now, just as the king had these deer hunting grounds, many of the gods had their own grounds. Those of you who are fans of Helen Mirren may have seen the film Queen. It's a very interesting series which is on Netflix, in which Helen Mirren is shown shooting a stag in Scotland. That's a royal reserve. She's also shown, the series Crown has a younger actor playing Queen Elizabeth, who goes grouse hunting in the moors of Scotland. Now, those moors of Scotland were emptied of their crofters who lived over there in very violent evictions. They were thrown out, made propertyless, and these vast areas were taken over for development of grouse hunting. So this is a very important set of traditions, which is very important in imperial India. What I want to emphasize is that there's a meeting of these imperial traditions, not only with the princely traditions, but with the traditions of the landed and feudal gentry in many parts of it. So those of you who recall school history will remember that in 1857, the British called it the Mutiny. We call it the Indian War of Independence, the first War of Independence. The Talukdars of Awadh rose up in revolt. Some did and some didn't. Those who rose up in revolt, their lands were seized, they were stripped of their titles, and the forests around their forts were auctioned to anyone who promised to clear them. They could keep the wood. Of course, they sold the wood. They earned lots of money. They chopped down the forest and they took it over, gave it to lots of peasants, and then lorded it over the peasantry. The other talukdars not only retained their privileges, the right to collect rents from the peasantry, and they were very, very repressive. They also retained their hunting grounds. And it's very interesting that just as the British civil and military officials hunted in the hunting grounds of the princes, they also joined the talukdars and zamindars in their lands. These zamindari, talukdari lands, forests are pretty large. They were taken over by government after independence. But in some parts of India, such as central provinces, Madhya Pradesh, which I worked on, the areas of the Malguzari zamindari forest were as large as the areas of the government forest. So what is a government forest? Here it's very important. In the 19th century, the British embarked on something which they had never done in England, or for that matter in Scotland or Wales or Ireland, which is to have government takeover of the forest. It's first attempted in Malabar, 1807, because they needed teak for shipping. The Royal Navy needed the teak for shipping. This fails as an experiment. In the 1830s and 40s, there are worries about climate change. There are worries about upsetting the water cycle. And there is a fresh push for reservation of forest, particularly in Madras and Bombay. But the real change comes about in the 1860s. The rapid expansion of the railway created a famine of railway timber. And in order to procure timber on a stable basis in 1864, they created a forest department. I'm sure that I can bore you with lots of details. My doctoral thesis was on forest policy in central provinces. Suffice it to say, remember the year 1864? In 40 years, just 40 years, 25% of British India is about half of India, 55%, 25% of that land is taken over as government forest. This was the largest forest estate on earth with any government. But there was a problem. In England, the forests were managed by the landowners. It is the landowners who supplied oak for the Navy, for instance, until iron-hulled ships came in the 1860s. In India, they brought in German and French foresters. I'm sure that all of you recall or have read about a boy called Mowgli. You know, he's supposed to have been brought up by wolves in the forest. And Rudyard Kipling wrote a rather fanciful book, which became a bestseller, The Jungle Book. And Kipling, of course, never went to the central provinces. He'd never been to the forests of Madhya Pradesh. He lived in his life out in Punjab. And he got a lot of his ecology wrong. Since many of you are interested in ecology, he put the red dog or the wild dog into the Deccan, and he put the wolf into the forest. And Mowgli, along with his brother wolves, hunts some. So obviously, Kipling got a lot of ecology wrong. But one thing he got right. You see, Kipling was living in a province which was dominated by the British, Punjab. It had large military cantonments. He himself lived in military cantonments. It had a large number of people who enlisted in the army, because the British Indian Army was raised from Punjab, Sikh, Hindu, and Jat Hindu and Muslim soldiers. And Kipling celebrated the accomplishments of the Raj. He wrote a very famous poem which said, "Make ye way for the Empress's mail. Make ye way for the Empress's mail." Empress being Queen Victoria, Maharani Victoria. The robber will run and the tiger turn tail. Just think of this in Hindustani. महारानी का डाकिया आ रहा है, डाकू भागेगा और बाघ जो है, शेर जो है, वो भी फरार हो जाएगा. So the Empress's mail is supposed to strike fear into the heart of the dacoit and the tiger. This is the civilizing idea of British power. And please remember, many generations of middle-class Indians celebrated this till the coming of the First World War and the Jallianwala Bagh massacre. Many, not all. Not all. There were always revolutionaries and people who dreamt of freedom. But they were an exception till 1990. Let me go back. In Kipling's world, Mowgli, when he grew up, joined the forest department. He became a forest guard. He got what is called in India a pakki naukri. You know what a pakki naukri is? You get a job and a pension. Well, Mowgli did that. And the first piece which Kipling ever published, which became the Jungle Book, was called In the Rook. Rook refers to a grassland. And he has the Inspector General of Forests, a large, gruff German who speaks English with a German accent. What is that? And this man is identified in the footnote as Ribbentrop, the second Inspector General of Forests. But actually, it could well have been Brandes, the first Inspector General of Forests. It could have been the third, William Schleich, also Inspector General of Forests. They were German. So German forestry or continental forestry was brought into India. And these forest areas were mapped, they were measured, they were assessed in terms of their value. What do you mean by value? A commercial value was put. The value was in terms of growing stock of timber. Timber was regarded as the measure of the value of the forest. There were different types of timber in different parts of India. If it was central India, it was sal. Southern India, it was teak. Northwest Himalayas, it was deodar and cheedo pine, etc., etc., etc. So much so that as late as 1968, when H.W. Champion sat down with S.K. Seth to write his book, The Forest Types of India, still used, it's a great classic. It's very interesting that the classifications follow very much the classifications which you would make if you looked at the forest in terms of trees. Recently, there's been a lot of critical work, Jayashree Ratnam and others, arguing that many areas they classified as scrub forest would actually qualify in Africa as savanna. But I want to concentrate on something else. If you look at books like Indian Trees by Brandes, very early classic, the work of Troop, R.S. Troop, the work of Schleich, or even the works of Champion and Seth, a disproportionate amount of time is given to timber trees. You're really struck by this when you look at mainland India, central India, and it's a large area. I don't just mean Madhya Pradesh. Trees very vital for livelihood and for the ecology of the forest, such as Mahua, Maduka indica, or Tendu, earlier called Diospyros melanoxylon, hardly figure. In fact, how to propagate these trees, how to grow these trees, how to make these trees flourish doesn't figure because they were not seen as important for revenue. This process, however, of taking control of the forest was deeply contested. In many parts of India, there was a crackdown on swidden cultivation, jhum kheti, shifting cultivation. And one of the drivers of that is that these forms of cultivation were seen as harmful to the regeneration of timber trees, teak or sal, just to give instances. The other problem is the person who did swidden cultivation or jhum kheti moved their plot from one place to the other. It was difficult to assess it in terms of land revenue. So here they were caught in a pincer between the forester and the land revenue staff. And there was an idea of a civilizing mission. You transform such peoples into sedentary cultivators. Equally hard hit were pastoralist groups. So if you look at the western Himalayas, Himachal Pradesh, Uttarakhand, Jammu Kashmir, these are areas where historically there were certain pastoral communities which migrated. They moved from the plains through the lowlands and the uplands to the edge of the alpine meadow and back. And in doing so, they were very important as traders. They linked people across the gradient, so to speak. They also sold hefty heifers to those who wanted it. They exchanged salt and grain. And interestingly, in this part of India, they conducted long-distance trade with Tibet. A lot of the Tibetan trade comes through these peoples. They really would get very hard hit by new notions of property, such as the forest land. There were areas where they were not allowed in. They were closed. Remember, it was a closed coupe for the regeneration of Devdar and teak, or Devdar and pine. Similarly, they were not allowed to fire certain areas. You see, they often set fire to the forest for fresh trees. That was not allowed. And a priority was given to the expansion of sedentary cultivation. So in the 1930s, there's a very important set of agitations, 2930 in Kumaon and Garhwal. Kumaon and Garhwal are the home of the Kumaon regiment, the Garhwal regiment. From 1815, the British have been recruiting forces from there. They get extremely worried. There's a forest grievances inquiry established. And Ram Guha, in his very important book, The Unquiet Woods, has a fantastic quote where the one of the people deposing before the commission says that there's a difference between you and us, he tells the committee. He says, we measure the productivity of the forest in terms of the litters of ghee. It's very important to understand this. The cows grazed in the forest, they ate grasses, and they fed on the broadleaf trees or browse. And then they came back home, and they were shuttered in a stall, which was covered with grass and hay from the forest. And this was then mixed in compost and used in the fields. And the milk was churned into butter, melted into ghee, and this was used in long distance trade. Next time you eat butter or eat cheese, and I'm sure all of you do, or you know someone who loves butter and cheese, remember, these are possible for long distance transport only because of refrigeration. Prior to modern refrigeration, long distance trade of milk products was in ghee. The reason is ghee keeps. You see, you can put it in a clay pot or a different type of urn, and it will keep for a very long time. This refers to ghee from buffalo milk or cow's milk or other such ingredients. The problem, he therefore said, is we measure the worth of the forest in terms of the litters of ghee, but you look at it in terms of litters of resin. What is resin? They were tapping the cheer pine for turpentine. This is a very interesting difference. It's not only in terms of the forest product, ghee versus resin. It's also in terms of the relationship with the forest. You see, the relationship with the forest, in one case, is a political economy of profit, because they could measure how much revenue is generated through resin or timber or other such products in a square kilometer plan or a square mile of land. Whereas a village would look at how many cattle could be supported by a particular forest. I want to go back to something I said about Robin Hood, which is very crucial. Robin Hood was not hunting deer only for food. He was hunting the deer to make a statement that there could be a contest over the form of property. It was not no property versus property, but the idea of every man's right versus the king's right. And the same thing happens in many parts of British India. It also happens in princely India. There's an assertion of right of access to the forest. I'm using the term forest loosely for uncultivated land. It could be rock, it could be run, it could be peel, it could be jail, it could be stub jungle, it could be a mature tree forest, it could be a mountain pasture. For now, just let me use this term jungle or forest. It's unscientific, but just for shorthand, we'll use it. In these areas, there was a contest for access, a contest for control, and a contest of property rights. The creation of this vast area of 480,000 square kilometers of government forest estate was a remarkable administrative accomplishment of the British Raj. The great historian of the world forests, Deforesting the Earth, it's a remarkable book. Michael Williams calls this a crowning accomplishment in administrative terms. But he also says it left a festering sore in the body politic, which has not healed to this day. What is this festering sore? It is these conflicts with herders, with grazers, with peasants who come in to collect lops and tops, with people who collect flowers, with those who access the forest for fertilizer, with those who pick up fruits, and very important, for those who hunted and fished in these areas. One of the very important provisions of the Indian Forest Act of 1878 is that forest produce belongs to the forest department in government forests. This includes, and it's a long list, hides, horns, tusks and tushes, ivory, and please note, fish. My student presently working on his thesis, Vaibhav Ramani, still writing up, has a very interesting section, looks at the conflicts over fish species in the Nilgiris and how they naturalize the trout in the Nilgiris for angling and fishing. Now, to help the trout, they also brought in lots of Australian varieties of trees which were planted along the stream. So you have this implantation of the trout along with the tree to create this ideal world for the angler. And they crack down very hard on local fishers who have different types of nets and who are interested in fishing for a living. There's a similar crackdown across on snares, on hunting, and on herbivores which are killed for meat. I was very struck in work in central India that in the 1890s, there's a very important set of droughts. It's very acute famine. And many of the waterholes, the herbivores were killed and eaten or sold. And there's a big crackdown on them as well. There are petitions in many provinces against the forest department because the cultivators feel that the forest has become the refuge for herbivores, which emerge at night to feed in the fields. It's interesting. Please remember that the major thrust of government policy was to eliminate carnivores, but the major conflict with cultivators was over herbivores. Let me carry on. I think by the late 19th century and around 1900, the idea of extinction had begun to be widely known among British officials and among many of the Indian educated classes. The Bombay Natural History Society is founded in the great city of Bombay in 1883, 2 years before the Indian National Congress. The Congress was also founded in 1885. But when I say Congress, I don't mean only the political party of today. It's a very important organization in the struggle for independence. It's a very important organization. And you're struck. Some of the people who are involved in the Congress are also involved in the BNHS. And the BNHS from the very beginning includes many Indians. It includes Parsis. It includes merchant classes. It includes princes. It includes sections of the emerging intelligentsia. When the young Salim Ali, not Salim Ali, as he reminded us, we asked him as a student when we met him, we said, how do you pronounce your name, sir? Is it Salim? He said, no. He had a good sense of humor. He said, Salim as in Salim. And Salim Ali shot a sparrow. He prided himself as a great shikari. So he and his cousins shot sparrows, cooked them, and ate them up with rice. So they regarded themselves as many future tiger hunters or whatever. And the sparrow had a yellow throat. Nobody knew what it was. So his uncle took him along to the Bombay Natural History Society. His uncle was in the civil service, Hamid Ali, ICS. And there, Salim Ali recounts this very beautifully. He was taken inside by the curator who opened a drawer where there were several specimens of different species of sparrows. And that day, Salim Ali says his life changed. He decided he'd study birds for the rest of his life. So I want to emphasize this, that Salim Ali writes the Book of Indian Birds, 1941. Stanley Henry Prater, an Anglo-Indian, by the way, an Indian, not a Brit, writes the Book of Indian Animals, 1948. These are the first type books of birds and mammals written by an Asian, except in Thailand, which was never under foreign rule, outside of Japan. In no Asian country, and I'm not including Russia, has such a book been written by an Asian. These books were written by Brits, or by the French, or by the Dutch, or the Portuguese, or whatever. Correct? So India is very unusual. It had an intelligentsia which absorbed elements of Western education. It's very crucial. And I think Prater and Ali, for me, are very interesting because the city of Bombay. You can find counterparts in different parts of India. And I think it's significant to me that in the period from the 20s to the 40s, you have very important nationalists among the British. To me, one of the very interesting figures, not very widely read, unfortunately, is a man called Dunbar Brander. He's very unusual. He had a twin. I don't know how many of you have twins. You know if you have twins? Well, these twins had different names. His name was Dunbar Brander. His brother was in South Africa. He changed his name to Brander Dunbar. A. Dunbar Brander was in India. He wrote books on shooting tigers. His book, The Wild Animals of Central India, is a classic. But half the book is about how to shoot tigers. It's got wonderful photos of tigers. They are utterly beautiful tigers, except that they're dead tigers. Dunbar Brander is in the photo or he's outside the photo. The tigers always. But Dunbar Brander studies tigers. He doesn't just hunt them. And in his book, 1923, he talks about how the tiger is vanishing in several parts of Central India. And he also makes a very interesting statement. He says there are some patches of forest where the number of deer and boars has grown so much and is such a pest for the cultivators that it would be sensible to release a tiger or two over there. This is a very interesting statement to make in 1923. And as we all know, Dunbar Brander in the Banjar Valley studies the Service Dwavasali or the swamp deer of Barasingha, which is then named after him. This is a conceit which Indians also and successive generations of people have. They find a new species, they name it after them, and they believe their name is there for history. Alan McTavish Hume, founder of the Indian National Congress, had it. There are countless birds which are called Hume so-and-so or Hume so-and-so. Of course, he was an ornithologist of note. He collected the eggs and feathers and so on and so forth. The other figure I think is a very fascinating to me, much more than Jim Corbett, who gets the press, is a man called F.W. Champion. Champion wrote With a Camera and Tigerlet and The Jungle in Sunlight and Shadow. And Champion is very interesting. In the 1990 to 21 period, the British fight wars with the Afghans. He's not involved in those, but he's involved in a lot of small infringements on the frontier. These are not small. They involve going and killing a lot of people, to put it bluntly. And the British were very savage in these wars. Please don't have any illusions. Aerial bombing, for instance, was pioneered by them in the 1920s in Mesopotamia, which is now Iraq. It was also attempted against the non-cooperation movement in Punjab. So what happens to Champion after this is he puts away the rifle. He says he was so repelled by the slaughter of men that he decided never to shoot animals except for food. Instead, he took up the camera. And much more than the tiger are the photographs and accounts of other animals. There are two very interesting books by his grandson, collections, A Tripwire for the Tiger, and there's a second book called Tiger's Champion. And they're very interesting because they include photographs, it's in one of the other books as well, of the pangolin. So first man to photograph the pangolin, very difficult animal to photograph even today. And he didn't use camera traps, but he invented them. The original inventor of the camera trap is Champion. And he went to the Shiva Lakes, what would later become Rajaji Park. And he set up these camera traps. And you know what's fascinating? Tigers had completely changed their behavior. They only came out at night because they're very intensively hunted. He mentions this. He set up these traps and he kept going on his elephant, Rampiari, and checking them. He got only 9 photographs of tigers. These are among the first photographs of tigers in the wild, which are not being chased by people. There are other photographs taken in shikar beats where the tiger is running for his life or is turned around and is charging the elephant and a photo has been taken. That's completely different. He also went to the Gola swamps where he recorded the massive herds of Barasingha, which were the preserve of the local zamindar. The Gola swamp is one of the areas which is drained and converted into agricultural fields after independence. And Champion had very interesting views on hunting. Champion believed he wouldn't hunt, it's very important, but he believed hunting was good because it kept out the poacher. You see, when it came to hunting and sport, he had very much a white man's view of the world. And in this, there's a remarkable overlap with Cobbett. I began with a quote of Cobbett. So one of the questions which was posed right at the beginning by Imran very well was, how far does a country become sovereign when it becomes independent? Part of that depends on how you define independence. And I think one of the things we should be clear is that in Asian and African countries, which became independent in the mid-20th century, they had been through the ravages of colonial rule and imperialism. It's difficult for us today to grasp what that meant. In India, British India, at the time of independence, the average male lifespan was 32 years. Barely 12% of the population was literate. Not even a railway wagon had been built in India. Not even a railway wagon. It's true, India had textile mills in Bombay from the 1860s. But the machine in the textile mill was important. Please remember, the machine was important. And the world had been through a horrendous episode or huge event in its history, the Second World War. I like asking my students when the Second World War ended, and they're all correct. They say 1945, the dropping of the bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But when did it begin? And most people will say 1st September 1939, Hitler's attack on Poland. But it didn't. It began in 1936 with Italy's attack on Ethiopia. It began in 1931 with Japan trying to take over Manchuria. And incidentally, all Russians will tell you that it began in June 41 when their country was invaded, the Soviet Union. And Americans will, of course, say very famous films, all of you know it, Pearl Harbor. Please don't watch it. It has nothing to do with history. It's just some love affairs of American sailors and all that. There's absolutely no history. But the Second World War unleashed force of a sort humans had never seen in history. It unleashed enormous destruction of humans on each other, but also of humans on nature. If you look at India, it was a very important staging force. 2 million Indians fought in the war. Correction, 2 million Indian humans fought in the war, and countless animals. The animals included 3,000 elephants, which were captured and sent off to fight in the Southeast Asian front. They were still fighting in the army, as they had been for 2,600 years. Hutchers were bred for the army. Horses were commissioned. Camels were sent off. There's a lot of very interesting work on the deployment of Indian animals and veterinary vets to look after them during the First World War in Iraq, which was then called Mesopotamia. 600,000 Indians fought over there. A lot of animals also went away. All of this was paid for out of Indian revenues. Please note, kindly note. Deployment of Indian troops outside India came out of Indian revenues. Their salary, pension, everything came out of Indian revenues. So when India becomes independent, there's a question which all Asian African countries faced when they became independent. Would the political independence have meaning if it was not backed up by economic independence? And economic independence to them meant industrialization. There were many debates on whether or not we should industrialize. And as we know, there was a huge debate in the freedom movement, Gandhi, Nehru, several others. And today we have remarkable work by Ram Guha, Speaking for Nature, where he describes several figures, many of them in pre-independent India, who talked about an alternative path. It's all very important. But when in power, and please be clear, when in power, nation states, capitalist, communist, democratic, dictatorial, have pushed for industrialization. There's a simple reason. Power of the nation state is measured not in terms of how many men it can put under arms or women, or how many battleships it commands, or planes, or even missiles. It's in terms of its modern industrial capacity. When I say industrial, I include post-industrial. I include software and all of these things. So in the India of the 1940s, 50s, 60s, the symbols of transformation were the steel mill, the fertilizer factory, the big dam. And all these came at an enormous environmental cost. So did the expansion of agriculture. This huge expansion of agriculture came at the cost of habitats. The intensification of production, which was entailed in damming a river, sinking a mine for bauxite, opening up new coal mines, putting up steel foundries, fertilizer plants. All of this is an intensification of the rates of extraction from nature. We all know from our knowledge of ecology, there's no such thing as production. Energy doesn't get produced. It gets extracted and it changes form. And in the 1930s, in one of the big debates, Meghnad Saha, a physicist, challenged Kumarappa and said, it's very interesting what he said. He said that you measured how developed a country was by looking at how much steel it produced, how many kilowatt hours of electricity it generated, and how much nitrogenous fertilizer it used or produced. I find all these interesting. Power, steel, fertilizer. All these come at an enormous environmental cost. And the interesting and significant point in a country such as India is, because it is so densely populated, 400 to 5 kilometers, because such a large population depends on primary products, fishing, herding, cultivation, gathering. It's 43% of the labor force. It's the only large country where 43% of the labor force directly depends on the land. In 1970, it was still 75%. In 1947, it was 85% or more. So when you have such a large population which is dependent on the land, it's not only more intensive production, which will create conflicts because people will be displaced either from their land, which they live on, or from the land they subsist on. So how does the issue of justice get figured into that? And here I think there's something very important. In 2006, the Forest Rights Act provided for recognition of rights of tenure to the forest. Long before that, there had been a recognition of rights of tenure to the land. Now, the famous film of Balraj Sani, Do Bigha Zameen, which is a short story by Premchand, is about that. So it's a very heartrending story. If you haven't watched it, please watch it. It's a remarkable film. Equally interesting film is called Mother India, which had the great Nargis. It's got some very lilting songs, and it's a farm family led by a single woman. It's a woman cultivator's woes. Her husband runs away, she's in debt, and one son becomes a dacoit, and it's a very, very difficult life. But these people had land rights. And just as there was a struggle for land rights, there's a struggle for forest rights. And I think India's challenge is, how do these rights get accommodated in a democratic and law-governed way? Now, one of the pluses of democracy is we're supposed to do this in a law-governed and democratic way. It doesn't always happen, but that's what has been attempted. Similarly, with the Land Compensation Act 2013, that if land is taken over, more than the market value will be paid. Now, these are not ideally implemented. I'm not suggesting that, but I think they're significant that they're there. And as a prelude to these, there was the Wildlife Protection Act 1972, the Forest Conservation Act 1980, one to help protect wildlife, one to slow down the transfer of forest land to non-forest land. Here, the term forest land would refer to land which is owned by the Forest Department or to land deemed as forest. There's a big debate on that. So where are we now? I think we're at a very interesting juncture where economic transformation has gathered in force. Both the intensification of production and commanding of more extensive resources for production. So the amount of land use per capita, or forest use per capita, or water use per capita, or mineral use per capita is very high in this mode of development. It's not equally high for everybody. This is a very unequal society. So how are the costs and burdens divided up? And I think this has a lot to do with forests and wildlife. One is always struck by how many of the forest areas are places where the people who live are very poor. Many of them are very poor, but the lands are very rich. Why? And one answer is they haven't got the benefits and proceeds of that development. This is something acknowledged across the board by parties. It's very interesting. They all acknowledge this. But how does one address it? This is a very major dilemma. How does one address it in a democratic law government? And I'll end with this. When you think of the diversity of India, you don't just think of the diversity of people. That is, of its languages, cultures, forms of food, and things we all enjoy: music, dance, multiple remarkable forms of architecture and of lifestyle, and so on. We also keep in mind its enormous diversity of life forms. The fact is that many of these life forms are now in deep danger. It's a remarkable book I'm just reading, Where Have All the Birds Gone, by Asad Rahmani. And it tells us, while there's a lot of concern about the tiger, there's hardly any about the greater adjutant stock. And I didn't know that the greater adjutant stock from 1896 was the symbol of the Municipal Corporation of Calcutta, which in its day was a very powerful corporation. Calcutta was a very, very rich city in those days. So, this attempt to strive for a balance in a law-governed democratic way, how is it to be done in such a society? And this is very crucial. And within this, the issue of forests, wildlife, environment, ecology is the challenge of the 21st century. It's the challenge. Because as we know, the consequences of species extinction, rapid ecosystemic change, global climate change will be felt by all, but it will be felt by human civilization very deeply. Humanity may survive any change, but will civilization in its present form, or does civilization make the adjustments and changes? And here I think there's something positive. We have in India many landscapes and waterscapes which have had a human presence for centuries, even millennia, and they've been productive, they've been habitable. What can we learn from the past productively and creatively? We can't pick up something from the past and just apply it. That's not possible. The situation is very different. Just look at the human numbers today compared to 1900 or 1600. But we can learn, because keeping those systems intact, the productive biological systems is crucial. The other part is that because there is a democratic framework, there is this tradition of modern science. There is also the tradition of many living practices on the ground of people who live very close to nature. I think we are in a position to conduct and attempt many forms of experiments and this is such a vast country, it's not as large as China or the United States or Russia, but it's still large, that what may work in one place may not work in another. But between them, we may manage to get quite a lot of things right. So on that somewhat optimistic note, I'd like to end, because I think independence is something to be celebrated, something to be cherished, but it also brings a great sense of responsibility. And one of the great responsibilities is learning from history in a creative way, not history in terms of giving magic silver bullet solutions, but thinking about the present and preparing for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Mahesh Rangarajan, sir. It was truly amazing talk, and it's really set up very nice thing for panorama for looking at the past and also thinking about our independence. As the question still is whether
I have if permitted, I wanted to make 2 points, small ones. Yeah.
yes,
Mahesh, congratulations. It was a wonderful talk. And I have just two observations. One is that when you were talking about hunting, I was reminding of a lot of British sources during the tribal rebellions. For example, the Pahadia Rebellion, Whole Rebellion in 1832, and the Santhal Rebellion of 1855. The British mentioned that we are hunting the ordinary people, the villagers, just like we hunt deer and tigers and pigs. And as soon as we see them, we shoot them. So probably the analogy of hunting tigers and other wild animals, the humans may probably like to be added in that list. As per the British sources, I'm not saying that these are folk tales, but the British themselves are saying it. Secondly, the way the forests were created and the British took over the forest, it seems that the presentation, the agency of the local people, I think that needs to be emphasized. For example, in Gujarat, we have a district called Dangs, where the British tried a number of attempts to invade it and capture it, but they could not. And finally, they had to lease the forest from the local chieftains and Dangs, because the chieftains never signed the accession, political accession to Britain. In the British system, it was governed from London as a foreign area. So it was a foreign area within India, because the chiefs, they could not conquer the forest chiefs. And Scaria and Hardiman have written on that quite a bit. And second, the Jungle Satyagraha, after the salt Satyagraha of Gandhi, the tribal areas, the people said there's no sea out here, so how do we break the laws? So they started breaking the forest laws by collecting bamboo, grass, wood, everything from the forest. So in the 30s and 40s, there was a massive wave of Jungle Satyagraha also as part of the national movement. So it's not totally one-sided. I mean, the people and the tribesmen there whose Sweden was prohibited and all that. So it's more of a interactive sort of a situation. But I think these are very general points. Probably the scope of your lecture was today very limited. So in your work, of course, you have covered all these points. So I want to thank you once again for a brilliant exposition. Thank you.
So, Professor Prasad, Dr. Prasad is my former teacher. He taught me many years ago in Hindu college. So, he distinguished civil servant, presently editing a 10-volume book on tribal rebellions in India. These points are very well taken. They're very, very significant. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
There are some questions written. Try and see what they are. Just a minute. Meanwhile, someone can go ahead. Wolves have faced extinctions in colonial occupied lands, Japan. Why do you think Indian wolves, though endangered, have survived? Japan, the extermination of wolves was in the 19th century. There's a very remarkable book by Brian Catton. There were two kinds of wolf, and in both kinds, they brought in American experts. That time, Japan was trying to learn from America, and they helped introduce very modern types of poison like strychnine to kill the wolves. It's part of the modernizing mission of the Meiji Restoration. Catton also shows us that there is an increase in wolf dog attacks on people and rabid wolves. There's a lot of popular anger against the wolves, so they're killed. Japan didn't have very many livestock, so the wolves often fed, for instance, on pigs, and they were perceived as a threat to the modernization project. Why did Indian wolves survive? One answer is the habitat of the wolves. The habitat of the wolves often is in open areas, scrub jungle, savanna, ravines. These are not forest areas.